But just creating the democracy is not enough. We need to do, and a lot of people do this, real deep education to give a certain moral character to that democracy that will make it anti-genocidal. And I have to be honest, if you look at if you look at democracies around the world, and again, we can debate, different countries, including the United States, is it a true democracy? I don't want to get into that. We haven't done a very good job of this.
This is Not to Forgive, but to Understand, with your host, writer and scholar of genocide studies, Sabah Karim. I am your co-host, Luis Gonzalez Aponte.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Henry Theriault is the Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at Worcester State University. With a distinguished career in philosophy and genocide studies, Theriault has chaired WSU's philosophy department and coordinated its Human Rights Center. He has authored pivotal works on denial, reparations, and mass violence against women and girls, and served as president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars.
Hello, Henry. We are here to discuss, among many other things, genocide denial. I've prepared two sets of questions. I've prepared two parts rather to this interview. The first one is about your paper on denial, and the second part is about reparations, the reparations committee that you were part of, where you discussed in detail the proposals going forward to make reparations for the Armenian genocide. The questions I have for you are as follows. Gregory Stanton comes up with the 10 stages of genocide. He cites classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, persecution, extermination, and finally, denial. Let's speak about the last stage, denial. It's not just Stanton, I think, who speaks about it as a last stage, but also Elie Wiesel. That's what I gathered from the article that you wrote. Now, for denial, Stanton says that, I quote, "It is the final stage that lasts throughout and always follows a genocide. It is among the surest indicators of further genocidal massacres. The perpetrators of genocide dig up the mass graves, burn the bodies, try to cover up the evidence, and intimidate the witnesses. They deny that they committed any crimes and often blame what happened on the victims. They block investigations of the crimes and continue to govern until driven from power by force when they flee into exile. There they remain with impunity, like Pol Pot or Idi Amin, unless they are captured and a tribunal is established to try them. The response to denial is punishment by an international tribunal or national courts. There the evidence can be heard and the perpetrators punished. Tribunals like the Yugoslav or Rwandan tribunals or an international tribunal to try the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia or an international criminal court may not deter the worst genocidal killers. But with the political will to arrest and prosecute them, some may be brought to justice." Unquote. Now, there have been many critiques of this stance by Stanton. One of the principal ones often cited by scholars in the field is by you in a 2021 paper titled, "Is Denial the Final Stage of Genocide? Consolidation, the Metaphysics of Denial, and the Supersession of Stage Theory." What is the premise of the paper?
So thank you for asking the question. There are a number of aspects of the concerns I have about the approach. The first most basic one is I think it's a misunderstanding of denial to see it as a stage of anything. Denial is a method similar to killing, sexual assault, and so forth that's used in the process of genocide. And it certainly exists as genocides are being perpetrated. And I've adopted the position following Fatima Muge Gocek in an earlier work of hers called Denial of Violence, on sort of violence against Armenians and others in the Ottoman Empire and into Turkey. That denial actually pre-exists genocidal violence. And if you think about this is actually not as counterintuitive as it sounds, because one needs to deny the evidence of prejudice, the evidence of oppression and so forth that almost inevitably pre-exists a genocide in order to sort of create the conditions that make it possible to commit genocide, both from a perspective of outside potential interveners, but also internally within a society. So denial is present at every sort of post and during genocide, every moment, and it functions in different ways. So I think calling it a stage is misleading, and causes some problems. That's not to say that denial is not incredibly important after the direct phase of a genocide is completed, although we can talk about whether genocides are completed in the sense that we often want to think. It doesn't mean that, but what it does mean is denial is not present as a stage. We don't move from killing to something, whatever it is, to denial, something like that. It's a very different kind of thing. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that if you must go with some kind of a stage theory, and I'll talk about that in a moment, really consolidation is the final stage of genocide. And what I mean by consolidation is the process by which the results of a genocide become irrevocable. They become a permanent, normal state of affairs within the world. So, for instance, if you look at the United States and indigenous peoples, certainly if you look at the East Coast of the United States, the destruction, even though there are Native American groups that are still very active, pushing for reparations and so forth, the process of consolidation is profound, right? Land is controlled. It's a kind of property, within a U.S. capitalist system. Their land is almost all taken by others, right, and occupied by others in a way that's gone back centuries, pre-existing the United States, in fact. And it's one example, right? The attitudes about whether, what happened, how it happened, why it happened, all those kinds of things are very fixed. And ultimately, with consolidation, you get to the point where a genocide is completed in the sense that its results become part of the global order. And we see this in a lot of other cases. And this is true even of genocides that I will call, that are things like the Holocaust that have been very, very well engaged. There have been responses, even reparative processes, right? At some point, those reparative processes, which are always limited, even in the case of the Holocaust, the reparations process has been profoundly limited and for me, very inadequate. There's a point where that kind of ends. In some cases, the consolidation still allows for the memory of a case of genocide and some ongoing attention to it and rectification. But ultimately, even that just gets folded into the order of the world, right? And so the whole, there's a sort of continuum of what level of consolidation. At the other end, you can think of groups within, say, the Amazon basin, right, that have been entirely wiped out, and with them, being wiped out, right, their land, everything, their existence is gone, and so the consolidation process is a complete elimination of them, even from historical memory, right? So that's sort of the continuum. The other thing I would add is that, and maybe this is a bit of the postmodern influence on me. I wouldn't call myself a postmodernist, but I'm certainly, was certainly heavily influenced by continental philosophy in my earlier career. That a stage theory itself really begs a lot of questions, right? Do events unfold in stages? Do we think of linear processes in some simplified, step-by-step way? Conceptually, that can be very useful. I would say if I'm talking to high school students, stage theory is not the worst thing because it helps them get some kind of understanding of how mass violence happens, right? It gives them something to hold on to. But it's woefully inadequate and incomplete for scholars to think in those terms. And if we really understand, and Stanton, in response to a lot of these kinds of criticisms over the years, Stanton and others have said, well, they don't mean literal stage theory. It's not that it has to be linear in the same order all the time. It's not that all the stages need to be present and so forth and so on, right? And we even can think of, at least under the UN Convention and certainly other definitions, a genocide where lethal violence is not very central or even possibly not present, although case law would suggest you need some level of lethal violence for something to qualify in practice in the international legal realm as a genocide. So we start to understand, so we start looking at stage theory and we realize, wow, it's not necessarily, the order doesn't necessarily matter. The stages don't need to be there, right? You could have 5 out of the 10 or 4 out of the 10 or whatever. And the process itself might not be nonlinear. One of the things for me that's very important in understanding genocide is that genocides can be cyclical as well. I do not mean cycles of violence where perpetrators and victim go back and forth. I think that is another problem in genocide studies, that people sort of latch onto that model too quickly. And I think historically, that's very rarely the case. It's usually victims who continue to be victimized in the long aftermath of a genocide, and quite often to sort of final extinction. We can see this in various cases. It's that genocides can follow a repetitive pattern. You can have multiple sort of things that you could parse as genocides. I'm looking at what Armenians are experiencing now, what they just experienced in the elimination of Armenian Artsakh by Azerbaijan and Turkey, and the genocidal intent that's been expressed by both Erdogan and Aliyev, and the actual invasion of Armenian territory right now, and the intent to get rid of Armenians from the entire Caucasus region, as another cycle in a 130-year process of genocide that began with the 1894-96 massacres under a previous regime, Sultan Abdul Hamid's regime, in the sort of waning days of the Ottoman Empire, and then the Young Turk process of genocide from 1915 to 1918, and then the Republican Turkish process from 1919 until 1923, when, for instance, Armenians who attempted to return to their homes in different places in the new Turkey were actually massacred to prevent the return of a sizable Armenian population, right? So this is more of a cyclical process, right? You have a genocide, you have some time, I'll call it a kind of static period where the violence is still ready to happen. It's kind of latent, but it's not actively being executed by the perpetrators. And then something happens, conditions change, the opportunity to sort of complete the next stage happens, and then you have the next cycle. And I think stage theory really misunderstands those kinds of long trajectories. And when we're looking at indigenous peoples, Armenians are indigenous to that area, but if you're looking especially at those who we consider indigenous in North America, for instance, Canada and the US, and we could talk about Australia as well, we see this sort of cycle, right? You have direct violence, say in the continental United States, western half, sort of west of the Mississippi. You have direct violence in all sorts of complicated ways throughout the 19th century. But in the 20th century, what you have is a new sort of method of genocide, using the boarding schools and using different kinds of law that broke property rights of Native Americans to hold property communally, which was their traditional way, and also allowed them to retain community identity. And you have all these processes happening in the 20th century, some assassination, some killing, but that was not the predominant feature, as another cycle of genocide to sort of take this residual population that survived and then subject them again to some kind of new process of genocide. So I'll stop there, but that hopefully gives you some idea of where I'm coming from in this critique. And I think there are a lot of other things to say about it, but this should give maybe 3 points that would be helpful for the audience.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And I think what is interesting here for me in particular is the idea that these cycles of violence, or rather not the cycles of violence exactly, but that the attacks against a particular group can be recurrent. That I probably overlooked while studying subject. Okay, so I have a second question about the approach you have generally to some of the papers you've written. So I think there's a second paper that interests me, where you again called into question one more stage that we spoke about, the 10 stages. So another stage that you called into question was dehumanization. So in a different paper, you delved into how what happens, because we recognize it as a fact, as a truism, that there is dehumanization before the process of attack, killing, violence takes place. You said that it's not exactly that. Could you elaborate?
Sure. Yeah. First, let me give a sort of global comment. You've highlighted a certain tendency that I have to question. You use the term truism. I think that's a useful thought. In genocide studies and in other human rights studies and even sort of political science more generally in certain other areas, there are ideas that are legitimate, that are based on some empirical evidence, but that get a kind of cachet or have an impact that far outweighs the empirical basis for those ideas. So, for instance, we talked about denial. Yeah, denial does happen after a genocide, But to say then it's a stage of genocide is really overreaching and misunderstanding. In the case of dehumanization, it's a little bit more direct in this way. And this was not a response to the 10 stages at all. This was a response to the wealth of work that says dehumanization is a condition that has to be met or is typically met as a way of understanding how large groups of people are mobilized to commit genocide when otherwise they wouldn't. So there are a number of issues there, and I'll get to the violence tendency question in a moment. But the first point would be dehumanization is present in a lot of cases. We see it. I mean, there's clear evidence of it. But when people look at that as the empirical basis of why genocides can happen, why people are willing to participate in genocide, they're ignoring other evidence. In a lot of cases, there are, actually, in any case of genocide, what you always have is excessive cruelty and a kind of torture that is not the kind of torture that is practiced against beings or even objects that cannot feel and experience. It's the kind of torture that makes sense only when you're dealing with human beings. I'll give you a very simple example. The taking of children or the killing of children in front of parents, particularly mothers, right, who are often left with the children after men in a community are killed or separated and so forth. And if your goal is simply to eliminate a population in a kind of cold, calculated way, which is the myth, something of the myth we have of the Nazis, by the way. I think there's a lot of cruelty that we don't see all the time because of this idea of, sort of cold calculation kind of thing, the Eichmann model, if we can say it that way. But if you're simply trying to get rid of a population, most or much of the violence that happens in a genocide is not only unnecessary, but it's counterproductive. It takes time, it takes effort, it derails in some sense the direct killing process or the direct destruction process. Now, you can argue that there are all sorts of reasons. For instance, sexual violence is used, right? It can terrorize a population, it can break community bonds, and of course, genocide isn't just about killing people. It's about, or in fact, it might not be about killing people primarily. It's about destroying group cohesion and bonds and the future and so forth. Lisa von Neurenforge's piece, Devil in the Details, does a great job of talking about this attack on life force atrocities as trying to break the future of the group. But when we see that this kind of violence is excessive, we start to realize, or at least I interpret that as the perpetrators understanding fully well that they're dealing with human beings. And they are engaging in violence that makes sense, again, only if it's human beings with a full register, right? If you're dealing with, I don't know, a very low-functioning mammal, say, taking children away probably won't have a profound effect on the mother that they're taken away from, right? Killing them in front, something like that, right? But for a human being, that has a profound, traumatizing, permanent effect, right? If you were to kill a child in front of a mother, that you can see from the survivor testimony that's not something people recover from. They might find a way to live, some of them don't, but it is always a profound trauma, right? And so inflicting that kind of violence it makes it clear to me that people who are perpetrating that kind of violence are thinking about their targets as human beings. I think sexual assault quite often has that component. The way it's perpetrated in genocide and in general doesn't make sense if we're talking about if you really think that the person being assaulted is an inanimate object. And again, the literature is complicated on this. If you look at some of the perpetrator accounts, in everyday rape and genocidal rape and so forth, it can get complicated. Gang rapes, for instance, you'll often have perpetrators say they don't even remember what the woman looked like, something like that. I think it's more complicated than that, right? Because we also have to take perpetrator testimony with a grain of salt and so forth. But there's also a lot of other kinds of evidence of the cruelty, the violence, the specific targeting of people and so forth. And so that register of violence makes sense as a human being. So my first point would be that I'm not sure that average people need to have dehumanized victims in order to do violence. And I would link that, I've talked about sexual assault, I would link that to the fact that we have another sort of truism that everyday societies aren't violent. They're not necessarily mass violent, but if you look at, for instance, the United States, the level of sexual assault, child abuse, and general violence in the United States on any given day is significant, right? It is a very significant amount. And what that means is people are already committing violence. They're already used to committing violence. Domestic violence is a great example where that's a long-term process of violence that someone repeatedly chooses, despite often feeling bad or whatever, continues to engage in, and continues to engage in someone who's an intimate partner, a child, a spouse, a significant other of some sort, a parent, whatever it is, who they have to see as human, right? They see them as human, right? That violence is there. And I think that the naivete that there isn't already a lot of violence that just needs to be directed in a case of genocide is really misunderstanding. And if I can add a footnote, I think part of the reason we hold on to that idea of dehumanization is it gives us a kind of hope for humanity. It's a naive hope. But as long as dehumanization is a key to genocide, then we don't see people as fundamentally capable of cruelty and violence with a full sort of objective understanding of what they're doing. We see violence as a mistake. It's really a Socratic, early Platonic notion of wrongdoing, right? Someone does wrongdoing because they're ignorant, because they don't understand what the right thing is. And so we think as genocide prevention and also as genocide sort of rehabilitation of perpetrators and so forth, that we have a path forward, right? It is a lot harder to face the notion, and I'm including myself in this, that we are all capable of violence and that violence is always happening. And genocide is just a particularly focused and extreme form of the violence that is a kind of constant in human society. And as long as we're not willing to deal with that constant violence, we're not going to be preventing genocide. So that's my first point. Second point would be that if you look at the way that many perpetrators experience what they're doing, it is not as an average human being killing an ant or kicking a rock, right? It's not like that, right? If the dehumanization model is correct, then they would be sort of acting as people sort of, again, you maybe have an ant infestation in your home and you sprayed pesticide. They would experience it like that. They're not. One of the features, and I always think of the Nazi embrace of the Übermensch, that concept of the superior Aryan, sort of godlike, powerful, superhuman, right? They think of themselves as above human beings, right? As in a position of power to decide the fate of human beings, to destroy them, right? And sometimes through the acts of violence, they get that sense of power, right? It's intoxicating. It's sick, but it's intoxicating and so forth. To the point where I would argue that itself, that sense of power, Israel Charney in an article on denial years ago actually talked about this also functioning as a way of people sort of pushing off their fear of death, right? If I'm capable of having this power and this ability to destroy others, I'm sort of invincible in the face of death. I control death, all these kinds of ideas. And so I think really an important mechanism that we fail to understand is the superiorization of the perpetrators, their sense of superiority, and very importantly, exceptionality. The idea that what they are doing is always justified. That yes, maybe killing people for normal people isn't okay, but we have a justification for doing this, and we have the right to do it. And that kind of exceptionalism is really dangerous. I'm in the U.S., right? I'm a total U.S. American upbringing and everything. And one does not need to look at U.S. history very far, and particularly foreign policy, to see the concept of U.S. exceptionalism being so central to how we think about things, right? Everybody else should be subject to international law, but we shouldn't be. We don't want other people committing violence and starting wars, but if we think we're justified, we're going to do that, and so forth and so on, right? And the sort of contradiction between what the U.S. does internally and externally and what it says other people should be doing itself is very clear. And this kind of exceptionalism is incredibly dangerous. It's why, for me, even when you can think that, okay, a terrorist act against oppression, some people would justify it as necessary, something like that. It's why that becomes such a dangerous line to cross, because once you grant yourself that exceptional status, it changes how you relate to all other people in humanity.
Yeah, as a side note, I just think that what you're doing is what scholarship should be doing, which is basically, people set down rules and principles about everything. And I think our duty is to keep questioning them and to basically show how having clear-cut, defined outlines and borders to any concept is actually very limiting in our understanding of phenomena. And what you're doing by questioning how these truisms about denial, about dehumanization, should be chucked out of the window, and that we should look at things in a wider sense, is absolutely, I think, a method that you have that I think is very unique to the way you approach.
No, I would add, I wouldn't say chuck dehumanization. I think it does have an important role. It does, you see it, but it's alongside this other process that's very different, and they work in different ways. It is true that some people get pulled into a genocidal project who might not otherwise, because of dehumanization, because they're sort of manipulated, all those kinds of things. But there are a lot of other people for whom that's not true. And if we really want to understand genocide, we need to be able to face all these different things. Yeah. It's not easy. The model I have is a lot more cynical about human beings, human conduct, and potential than the more error-based kind of idea of violence. So.
And so, still on the subject, I think what interests me as well is a conversation that we had a while ago, where you spoke to me about putting into question the idea that genocidal regimes often spring up under totalitarian or fascist regimes rather than democratic ones. In other words, you claim that genocidal regimes can also emerge where the system of government is democratic. Would you like to tell us more about that?
Sure. Yeah. And I do want to have a footnote here that not all my work is like this. This is a particular strain in my work of questioning some of the sort of ideas that have some basis, but then become just, almost mantras that people can't question or just repeat over and over again and so forth, and that close off or limit real intellectual engagement of things. And I would add also, we want to keep in mind, we also want to keep in mind, and I would say my reparations work tends to be more constructive. It's not built out of a reaction. This is more reactive work to ideas that are problematic. But we also want to keep in mind, genocide, as any other socially constructed activity, evolves over time. I had written a paper years ago on this evolutionary process and looking at the ways in which sophisticated perpetrators, particularly in the last 30 to 40 years, understand legal questions around genocide. They understand what they might get tried for. And we see it even now, like the way that genocide is perpetrated now after the Rwanda and former Yugoslavia trials and other things that have happened is different. Perpetrators are smart. They cause evolutions in genocide because they don't want to be subject to the law. So as soon as we get a law in place, perpetrators will find a way around that law. And so genocide itself is a dynamic, evolving process. It's a sick creativity, but it is nevertheless a creativity. And so we have to be very careful of getting locked into certain ideas that might have applied even in the past more than they do in the present as things change. So going back to the question of democracy and genocide, again, is democracy a good thing? Absolutely, given, the Winston Churchill, it's a terrible form of government, but it's better than everything else, if I can paraphrase, right? Every other one is much worse. And I think that's true. It has a lot of issues, as we know. I mean, simple things like tyranny of the majority, which we still see, say, in U.S. electoral politics today, and other kinds of things that happen. It's manipulatable, especially in the age of the internet. It becomes easier and easier to manipulate people simplistically to vote in certain ways and to participate in their government, their society in certain ways. There are all sorts of problems, right? So basic problems that we're well aware of. But at the same time, it has a lot of positives that come in as well. And until we figure out the sort of next evolution in human political structure, what the thing, democracy emerged as dominant at some point, there'll be other ideas. I'm kind of partial to the idea of randomocracy, where you just randomly choose people to lead. I'm more and more convinced, this is maybe a old Greek idea, but I'm more and more convinced that picking someone at random would probably give you a better government than ones that we typically elect within all these sort of problematic processes and, propaganda and all the kinds of things that now dominate the, for instance, the U.S. political scene. But setting that aside for a moment, So we don't know what possibilities yet. And I try to think about these things in my hat as a political philosopher and haven't gotten very far. But what new possibilities would be there that could even be better, right? But it becomes very dangerous when we become complacent. Democracy has all sorts of problems. The U.S. slave system was perpetrated by a democratic government. Every genocide perpetrated by the United States, internally and externally, and the list is long and bloody, has been perpetrated by a democratic government. Now, we can quibble about, some people say, well, it wasn't truly democratic, it excluded people and so forth. But democratic governments always have exclusions. In fact, they require exclusions, right? There has to be, if we go back to Helen Fine's idea of an in-group and out-group, there has to be an in-group, right? And typically in the age of nation states, the in-group is defined as those citizens within a set of borders. And so those outside, we can see this in U.S. policy, right? If you're inside the borders, you have certain rights. If you're outside, you don't have rights, relative to the U.S. And this is true across most states. The internal rights will vary, right? And so there's always with any democracy, there's the group that actually has democracy relative to the society, and there's everybody else. And everybody else is, again, using Helen Fine's, outside the universe of moral obligation. And even within many democracies, again, I'll use the United States, there are always internal marginalizations that are happening. And you can pick any age in the United States, and you'll see dominant ones and also some other marginalizations that are less prominent but still very significant. And so in any democracy, basically the formula for genocide is when that majority that controls electoral power decides that it wants to do violence to or eliminate or in some other way compromise the sort of future of any of these marginalized groups inside or outside its borders. And I would say outside the borders can be easier, right, because of that indirect, at a distance kind of thing where you don't even have to really confront the violence that you're doing, right, which goes a little bit against, maybe that feeds into the dehumanization model a bit. But even internally, that's very possible. We see this again and again and again. And so I think that's really important. If you look at Nazi Germany, the evolution of Nazi Germany, right, and again, I'm not a Holocaust scholar, so I want to be very careful how I tread here. But if you look at the evolution of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, if you go back, yes, there was anti-Semitism in Germany in 1900 and 1920 and so forth. There were anti-Semitic movements. There were all that kind of stuff. But Jews also had a level of integration into German society. And in some places, you could think of them, they were just another religion, another cultural group, something like that. And it took a huge effort for Germany to sort of otherize Jews, right? And others in Europe. They had to tap all these anti-Semitic tools that sort of were latent in society or were being used by a small minority and turn them into the sort of central pieces of the central ideology of their state, of their nation, and so forth. And so, when we look at these kinds of marginalizations, right, they're fluid, they're often intentional, and so forth. And democracies can produce them, right? There was no reason for the United States. Well, this happens under British colonization, but there was no reason for the United States. Actually, I'll say this: after slavery, right, was the point the United States had control. There was a period of about a dozen years where the U.S. saw one of the highest points of integration of African Americans in 1865, 1877 period, where African Americans were political leaders being elected to national office and local office and so forth. There was this moment where things opened up, and there was a real possibility of anti-racist transformation in the United States that was cut off by a white backlash. That led to extreme forms, essentially an apartheid society with Jim Crow and other features that again got challenged in the civil rights era in the United States and so forth. So these marginalizations, when the majority that is able to do this electorally or in terms of raw power, does develop the idea, does think it serves its interest, does simply act out of some kind of ideology, then a democracy is fully capable of genocide. And the historical record is full of this. And democracy in itself is not a foil to genocide. Again, we see this. And in fact, in some cases, a democratic state can be more effective in committing genocide. If you look at U.S. Native American genocides, one of the features that's very different from, say, Nazi Germany or certain other cases that are characterized in a similar sense. Maybe Rwanda is another example of this, where you had a very tight national government that controlled the process of genocide, and everything was sort of done hierarchically. In contrast to that, the United States not only it did have a sort of federal level process of genocide, but sometimes the federal government moved a bit against genocide. But there were multiple layers or levels, governmental and non-governmental, within the United States that participated in genocide of Native Americans for different reasons, through different methods and so forth. And I actually argued in one piece that one of the features of the United States committing genocide against Native Americans is that genocide had a very significant privatized and individualized component. And it makes sense. You know, if German culture tended towards centralization, industrialized bureaucracy, and so forth, U.S. culture tends towards very significant local autonomy and independence and so forth. And so you had a lot of people sort of committing genocide without tight centralized control from the federal government, and sometimes even against federal government policy. So democracy can be very dangerous because it actually it allows people to have a kind of agency, or supports a kind of agency that, if it's a genocidal agency, is much more widespread and embedded in a society than you would have when you're being forced to commit genocide in some sense by a central authority, or that central authority is the driving force behind genocide.
No, I just want to say, surely there have been many people who have opposed this statement by you, and I think it may sound very shocking to people because of the obvious fact that we revere democratic forms of government over totalitarian ones. I mean, again, it's put out as a truism. Yeah. Have you encountered any resistance to this idea thus far?
Yes, from scholars I think the world of, who, after I did a presentation on this at the last International Association of Genocide Scholars conference in Barcelona last summer, yeah. And in fact, the reaction at times seemed visceral. Great people. I mean, don't get me wrong. These are great folks. They're very thoughtful, very engaged, and they have good ideas. This is not the kind of reaction you get just because someone's not willing to think through. But at the same time, it is a shocking concept if you start to think about that democracy promotion, which, if you talk to, I mean, you hear U.S. State Department, whatever, that's the panacea for everything. And what the U.S. means by democracy really means installing a government friendly to the United States. It doesn't really matter if it's democratic or not. But to have questioned this simple mantra that everyone builds policy and violence prevention programs and so forth, right? When people have entire careers that are built on this model, when they're running multi-million-dollar projects that they have big grants for based on this model, and you call it into question, of course, there's a really difficult process of trying to engage that. And it's easy to dismiss the one new idea when you have that Quinean web of beliefs that has so much installed this idea of democracy as just a sort of panacea for everything and just automatically good compared to anything else. And what I would add is, I think sometimes people misunderstand. I've never said democracy is a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's good. Best form we have. I agree with that. But democracy is underdeterminative when it comes to the violence committed by a society. In other words, if we simply rely on democratization to prevent genocide, we've lost. That's not going to do it. There needs to be an ethical dimension, there's a whole layer of commitments, right? So if the majority of a society is inclusive, is anti-violent, right, is respects rights of those even who do not necessarily have them legally within the core group, and who doesn't believe that if the majority has power to do an act, it has the right to do that act, that can separate those two things, then that democracy is probably going to be anti-genocidal, right? But just creating the democracy is not enough. We need to do, and a lot of people do this, real deep education to give a certain moral character to that democracy that will make it anti-genocidal. And I have to be honest, if you look at if you look at democracies around the world, and again, we can debate, different countries, including the United States, is it a true democracy? I don't want to get into that. We haven't done a very good job of this. We still see, democratic governments engage in genocide. I would simply add that if there's a tendency to kind of look only at the 20th century and later when we're talking about democracy. Let's not forget that the characteristic 19th century genocide was perpetrated by Western European, American, Australian, quote unquote, democracies again through colonization against indigenous peoples, right? And so democracy's track record is pretty horrible if we actually look at the whole sort of democratic, modern democratic period in these democratic states. And it's easy for the United States, even though we continue in the 20th century, say in the 21st century, it's easy for the United States to say, look, we're a democracy. We're not committing direct genocide against indigenous peoples. Well, why not? We already did it, right? It's already done. So there's not really a genocide to perpetrate now. But to then do all this violence and then wash your hands and then think that now the system you have is not tied to that past violence, I think is naive to say the least, but I think, much more cynical than that.
Makes sense. Thank you, Henry. We have a second part here where we'd like to speak about reparations. So more specifically, you produced a report of the Armenian Genocide Reparations Study Group in 2015. This also marked the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide that took place in 1915. Now, the genocide against the Armenians has been aptly denied by the Turkish government, the main perpetrators. What are the ramifications of denial?
So if you were to had asked me that 5 years ago, I would say very clearly two things. One is that denial prevented a reparative process, and a reparative process in a material sense on the one hand, but also a symbolic or emotional sense for Armenians. And we should mention Assyrians and Greeks also fully targeted in this process as well. It prevented, a kind of healing process for those populations, but also the material changes needed to support, for instance, the fact that Assyrians have no homeland, the fact that Armenians, the Armenian Republic as it exists, is a residual that is tremendously weak and poor and vulnerable because of the genocide. Easy example is, if you did population projections, I'm following Richard Hovnessian, who's an esteemed scholar of Armenian studies and Armenian genocide studies, who passed away last year, who said in 1991 at a lecture that I attended as a student, gave me this idea. He said, look, even if the genocide of 1915, 1923 happened, but the 1918 Republic of Armenia that had been established as a moment of reparation by the victorious Allied powers had been allowed to stand and just continue into a future like any other country, by 1991, the population would have been something like 18 million people. And to look at that changes everything for Armenians. What it means is, even with the genocide, they would have had a kind of stability in the world, an ability at self-defense and security, an economic power. Maybe power isn't the right word, but economic resources to function in a really productive way. Cultural security in ways that are not possible without that kind of a state, and so forth. And so the denial, which was also a refusal of reparations, and some would argue a big point of that, Dikran Kalijan actually, had said this very early on, that denial was about stopping reparations. That's been always the game. And if the Turkish government thought they could acknowledge Armenian genocide without any ramifications, they would have done it years ago. So that's what I would have said, back a decade ago, back at that time of the report. And that's what I did say. Things have changed dramatically. The implications of the failure, first of all, for reparations for Armenians, and the insecurity and the economic, political, military, vulnerability that is a result of genocide, which is true of, pick your indigenous group. We see it all the time. That has been devastating as Azerbaijan and Turkey have reignited or restarted the genocidal process that was begun actually in 1894, 96, but certainly in 1915, which both have said is about eliminating Armenians from the Caucasus region entirely, which means eliminating the Republic of Armenia with its 3 million people, eliminating any basis for Armenian peoplehood in the future in a kind of stable, permanent way. And they are explicit about that. And we saw the first part of that in the elimination by Azerbaijan and Turkey over the September 2020 through October 2023 period of the, more than 2,000 year presence of Armenians from the Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh region of the Caucasus. And this is a whole, we don't have time to get into the details of this. This was a long-term project by Azerbaijan, even under the Soviet Union. There was a whole process during the Soviet period of de-development of Armenians, pushing Armenians out of this region, resettlement of Azeris to change the demographics, cultural, pressure. I mean, there's all sorts of things. But it really culminates in violence in the early 1990s. Armenians defend themselves, but then ultimately is finished as Azerbaijan, through oil money, and Turkey through the waning power of Russia, are able to assert themselves in a very effective way against this small Armenian population of 140,000 people, and against the full Armenian population of 3 million. Remember, this is 90 million people, including one of the world's top 20 economies, against a small, landlocked 3 million person state whose main previous benefactor, Russia, had basically pulled back its support. So it was left, completely alone. The United States did nothing to help. The European Union did almost nothing to help. And so that's, if we think about the implications of genocide long-term, this is what it is. Genocides that weaken a group often culminate with the 50 years later, 100 years later, 200 years later, ultimate extinction of that group, because these processes continue. Sometimes they don't have to be active, sometimes they are. And so my argument now is reparations, the failure to have reparations, is what is leading to the ultimate destruction of Armenians today. And that's what I would say, yeah.
Isn't it possible to have reparations happening at the same time as genocide being committed by perpetrators? If you know what I mean.
I would say, well, if we think about reparations, we need to talk about real reparations, right? So reparations there's a material component. It can be land return, compensation for lost labor, destructive, deaths, the demographic destruction, and so forth. But it has other components as well. Criminal justice, I would consider also part of that. That's not as relevant. It's not relevant to 1950. It's become relevant, unfortunately, because of recent violence and the atrocities committed by Azerbaijan and Turkey against Armenians. So that's relevant, but not for the past. But there are other obvious things, symbolic reparations, which are about things like apology, broad education globally, those kinds of things. And I would add, and that's very important, but another piece of this that's crucial is perpetrator rehabilitation. So when a society commits genocide, and again, I'm saying this as somebody in the U.S. who sees this embedded in my society, but it's certainly embedded deeply. The people who committed the 1915 genocide against Assyrians, Greeks, and Armenians didn't leave Turkey. Some of them fled, some of them were killed, but the bulk of them were the people who formed the Turkish Republic. And they formed it, for instance, through generating an economy using the expropriated wealth of Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks. I mean, Turkish intellectuals will talk about this, right? That's where the economy comes from. And when they built their institutions, they built them around this genocidal project that they had successfully completed, right? It's not it's obvious why Turkey has treated the Kurds, right, in a mass violent, I would say at times pro-genocidal way, although it's a little bit different, over the 20th century and into the 21st century, right? That mechanism of genocide was already there. It was looking for its next victim, right? And so politically, intellectually, in terms of academia, militarily, economically, genocidal mentality as well as practices, cultural elements, and so forth get embedded in a society. And unless a rehabilitative process happens where that society actually extirpates those tendencies, and really, we talk about denazification after World War II and the Holocaust, right? And that was even very incomplete and handled and very politicized, if I can say it that way, given the U.S. attitudes about some Nazis who were useful to us, so we didn't worry too much about them. But at least some kind of process like that, right? The genocidal intent is still there. The genocidal mechanisms are still there. The attitudes are still there. And I think we've seen in the last 3 years, Turkey was ready to jump into genocide against Armenians at the drop of a hat when the opportunity was there. And so I think that's really important. The other thing that's really crucial and this is one of my additions to the report, is a responsibility for the security in perpetuity for the genocide victim group. The perpetrator group takes on that responsibility because what they did permanently weakened the victim group. And so, for instance, the United States government doesn't just have a responsibility to tolerate Native American groups, to give them a little space. We have an absolute responsibility to ensure the vibrant, well-resourced, culturally respected, not just survival, but thriving of every indigenous community in the United States. We have that responsibility. We need to protect them from the dangers that are happening. We need to protect them from violence and so forth. And no genocide perpetrator does that. I mean, you can look even at Germany. There's really a residual Jewish community in Germany anyway, right? So they're not really doing that. But most others continue actively undermining the long-term viability of victim groups. And that security, I mean, you think about the difference. If Turkey actually had a responsibility for the state security of Armenia because of the genocide, nothing that's happened to Armenians, this renewed genocide, could have happened, right? So it's another feature. So I think there's a lot there to really look at when we talk about reparations.
I don't know if this question is relevant, but we're speaking about Turkey. We're using this word, and it's a collective noun. And question to you is, within the Ottoman, within Turkey right now, since we're talking about the genocide that just recently happened, which factions deny the Armenian genocide, for instance, and which factions are the perpetrators?
Yeah, I'm going to do something I shouldn't do as a scholar, which is say, this is a little bit outside my area of expertise. So I'm not a Turkologist, so I don't know the intimate or internal details of Turkish society well. I know I read what people are producing, so I have some sense of this, and I've worked with people in Turkey and so forth. But Turkey and Azerbaijan, it's very important to point out, Azerbaijan is also like this. The United States, any society, right, has a whole complex of internal political forces, attitudes, and so forth. And in every society, right, let's not forget that 300,000 Germans, who were considered opponents of the Nazi regime, right, who were imprisoned and so forth, right? People were against the Holocaust. Germans were against the Holocaust. There were a lot of people like that, right? In Turkey, people fought against the genocide. For instance, leading clerics were against it, especially the push to declare jihad against Christians in the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, many of them had to lost their positions and were replaced by more pliant clerics. Local governors in some cases refused to implement genocide orders and lost their positions. Many people risked their lives. And this is true in any society. And I've even, in the recent violence with Azerbaijan, you still can read statements by Azeris, right, who say, wow, I really feel bad about, we don't want to be killing Armenians, things like that, right? There are good people in every society. It's probably the same mix in every society, same percentage of people who would not commit genocide who are against it. And I admire them. I haven't been in a position maybe where I've had to make that stark a choice, but hope I would make the right choice. But, so societies are very complicated. And Turkey has had a very strong movement toward recognition of the Armenian genocide and even reparations. And one of the first people, Ragip Zarakolu, who's an incredible activist in Turkey, brilliant guy, was a close friend of Hrant Dink, who was the Armenian, who was assassinated in 2007 for talking about the Armenian genocide, even though he tended to avoid the word and all sorts of things. He, back, more than 15 years ago, started talking about substantive reparations for Armenians. Even when I was talking about it, but I was a little hesitant. Who's going to take this seriously? That kind of thing. And as a Turk who had spent a lot of time in jail because of his opposition to the Turkish government in different ways, including on the Armenian issue, Kurdish issues, and so forth, he was saying, right? So people are willing to really embrace in every society. And the things will vary. You can look at Japan and its legacy of, the comfort women, the Nanjing massacre, and so forth out of the World War II era. And Japan's like a 50% society. Like half the society really wants to acknowledge and recognize and repair and so forth. And then half the society is in denial and so on. This is true of most societies. And you talk about democratization. So one of the ideas, if you really want to democratize Turkey, and ultimately democratize Azerbaijan, which I think is necessary for the survival of Armenia, it needs to be one that embraces these folks, right? As you know, with the Erdogan crackdown over the past few years, a lot of these intellectuals, for instance, who are speaking up on behalf of Kurds, Armenians, and others, were jailed, right? So they were marginalized. Their voices had not only were not allowed to participate in the democracy or in the governmental debates and the public debates and so forth, but they were completely marginalized, pushed out of any possibility of engaging. And this is very typical of authoritarian regimes. There's the democracy movement in Azerbaijan, and we need to recognize their struggles, which are often dangerous and require sacrifice. And I think if I have a hope going forward in different kinds of genocidal regimes, including the United States, it's that those groups over a long period of time can educate people and build a critical mass to really change the character of their either democracies or to create a democracy out of totalitarian or authoritarian structures that will be a real democracy, legitimate, inclusive, anti-genocidal democracy.
And so I have a big question because it encompasses many different components, but here is the question. So the study group was set up in 2015, that's 12 years ago. I think you did touch on some of the main ideas which were proposed, reparations, but I'm curious to know more because I did read the report and I saw that there was a division into various categories and all that. And I do want to know in more detail what's happened since then. And also just a little bit about the genesis of all of these ideas about reparations. Where do they come from? What is basically something you draw from, precedent, and what is what you were innovative about in the report?
Yeah, so that group actually started in 2007. We did a lot of work, and we actually had a draft report we were circulating. There was a conference at UCLA Law School that was organized around our report in 2010. We did some work, and then we ultimately decided we wanted to release it in 2015 to kind of create, a historically appropriate impact, because this was a point where this issue was on people's mind. And don't forget, this was also a period, well, I would say 2014, 2015 was the end of this, but there was a period in the 2000s, sort of following the assassination of Hrant Dink in 2007, up until maybe 2013, somewhere in there, where Turkey itself was undergoing a lot of what appeared to be very positive possibilities. There was a growing democracy movement. There was a growing recognition of the Armenian genocide. I spoke in Turkey in both 2010 and 2015. And I have to say, even though state security was there, even though it was scary, bomb threats, all that kind of stuff, I was able to talk about, and I think was the first person probably since the genocide to, in Turkey to lay out an explicit claim for territorial reparations. And I was allowed to do that. I was allowed to get back on the plane and go back to the U.S. So there was a moment of openness, and then Erdogan just, closed that door completely out of his own, political agenda. So we had a lot of hope. I had a lot of hope that this was the time to really start these discussions. And so part of it was reparations was the path forward for both Turkey and Armenia. In my view, Turkey engaging the Armenian genocide and Greek and Assyrians as well in a meaningful way is the way forward for Turkey. If Turks really want a good society, if they want a society they can be proud of, not a weak nationalism, ultra-nationalism that's based on violence and is so frail and open to so much criticism, but a really strong sense of ethically based nationalism. If they want a place in the world that's unquestioned, right? They could actually, now I had said this at the time, they could take the lead because no one else is doing it. The United States is not doing anything meaningful. Australia in 1997 does a great report, and then within 3 years, they're sort of backing off from it, right, on the Bring Them Home report. Societies aren't doing this. Turkey actually could have gone from a country widely criticized as authoritarian, as genocidal, all these kinds of things, to a world leader in this anti-genocidal, pro-democracy movement. They could have established themselves. Obviously, they didn't take that route, but there was a potential for that. And so for Turkey, this is essential as well, right? I mean, they can still have power, and they can maybe have more power. They can still go forward as a Turkey, for another 100 years or however long, their society lasts before it implodes because of the internal problems. But to be a really good society, they need the reparations as much as Armenia. And I've got an article, and I'd written about this a few years ago an article on impossible harms, the point at which reparations becomes impossible. And I use the comfort women example for Japan, that Japan, by all its denial and waiting from the 1990s into the 2010s, was actually destroying the one opportunity it had to prevent a permanent taint on its history. Because the comfort women, the former comfort women, were all elderly by then. There are still a very few alive, and I've got a drafted article I want to send out, for more journalistic publication. Or I just have to get it out. This is the last chance to do something for some surviving comfort women. And if you miss that opportunity, forever, your society can never do anything to address the horrible harm that it did in the past. And for me, that's I called it an impossible harm. It's not the best label. But there are different things like this. And so for Turkey, it's got a window. If Armenia is destroyed, that's it. That may be its goal right now, but that's it. Turkey is forever a genocide perpetrator. We can think of North and South American countries, including the United States. There are many extinct indigenous groups, right, who are destroyed through genocide and other processes that have state-driven. Nothing can ever be done, right? The United States is forever a genocidal regime. Right? We can maybe do something to make that better than worse, but it's there. And it's really, so reparative justice is really important in this way and sort of for the future. And that's where this whole genesis of this came out. This was a historical moment where we needed to really think about that. And I can get into my personal thinking about this, but it's probably not as interesting than the historical issues. And then in terms of the reparations, the thinking about reparations, I have to be honest, a little bit of it was spawned by my experience as a graduate student of 1992 in the United States, and the attempt by indigenous groups and others to try to finally get the historical record out there of the destruction that started in 1492 by Christopher Columbus invading the Americas and unleashing. I mean, he was a major genocide perpetrator in against Taino and others, and what followed was horrific, as we know. And so thinking about that moment and then the backlash in the United States, which was devastating, made me understand how challenging this issue of repair, of historical repair, is. And Native American groups in the United States ask for very little, to be perfectly honest, and are often denied that, right? And so there's so much resistance to reparations. And so to try to think about, okay, if we've got a historical moment where something possibly could happen, but also if we give in to that pressure against talking about reparations, right? Because it's so hard, because there's such a backlash. We remove the one lever that victim groups, survivor groups have, which is the moral authority to continue to claim that they were wrong and that they are owed something. And I have debates among Armenians with this all the time. Many Armenians are against reparations to the Armenian genocide because they think they just want recognition and go on for the future and all this kind of stuff. The Armenian government's position is that, is explicitly that, and has been for a bit. And for me, even if you're cynical and you're just looking as a bargaining tool, giving up your most important lever doesn't make sense. But more importantly, if you want a future as a state, you have to hold on to the possibility of reparations to get as a part of the recovery that you really need to be viable long term. As a philosopher, a refugee from philosophy at times, but a philosopher, I certainly am attuned to arguments and arguments that often are ideologically tainted, which you see a lot of in a lot of the sort of public debates about these kinds of issues, racism, reparations, all sorts of things like that. And as I looked at the way reparations was typically talked about, I looked a lot about, Native American, African American, Armenian, other contexts, and look at the arguments that were used against reparations, I started realizing how bad those arguments actually were and how much they assumed in problematic ways. So for instance, there's the argument against time passage, right? Long past genocide shouldn't be repaired because, well, they're long past. Time heals all wounds. In fact, if you look at the way that genocide trajectories unfold post-active genocide, it's typically gets worse and worse for the victim groups over time. I've talked about the Armenian case, but indigenous groups become more and more vulnerable over time. Their identity becomes less and less cohesive. We're seeing a massive loss of small language group languages in the current era, and part of that is because of this. And so just the whole idea of time, actually what I argue is time makes things worse. The passage of time makes the debt, the reparative debt, even greater than it was, because with each year, more damage sort of accrues against the victim groups. And let's not forget, the perpetrator groups are investing all that they gain economically, their political security, their identity cohesion that often is sort of produced or enhanced through a genocidal process. All that, because they're not on the spot at all, they have this very comfortable existence post-genocide, becomes increased, right? And so the perpetrator-victim sort of divide becomes greater, but also the real objective situation of victims becomes worse. And so that's one example, this idea that time, the passage of time tends to mitigate against the obligation of reparations, I would oppose. And again, that's one of my oppositional things, I guess, but it's worth articulating.
So I think I have one last question, because we're running out of time, but my question is about, do we need, in view of what you have said about the report issued in 2015, do you think we need a second one to maybe revise whatever is there already?
Wow.
A second one, which is maybe an amended one with probably...
Yeah, I've actually thought about
proposals with proposals just because you may, of course, with time, we always get more clarity and we start to see how things could have been probably a bit different than what we thought of them back then. So that's why I'm referring to that. Not in any way to good question.
No, this is great. Let me thank you for that comment, which is more of a comment than a question. And I had just thought a little bit about what new damages have been done, in the last 4 years that need to be addressed. That's added to the sort of obligation. But I hadn't thought about that kind of a project, that you're suggesting, which is really rethinking this whole sort of thing, both in terms of what we've learned over the past 10 years, but also in terms of the changing situation for Armenians, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and others. So that's a great idea. So you've given me homework, which I guess, at the end of a podcast isn't a bad thing. And I appreciate that. So I'm going to think about that quite a bit.
Well, it was lovely speaking with you, Henry. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Sabah, and also to Luis, who's been in the background making this happen. I really appreciate the chance to share some ideas and the great questions. And hopefully down the road, after that second reparations report comes out, we'll be able to talk again.
This was Not to Forgive, but to Understand, with our guest, Henry Theriault. To our listeners, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more discussions.